Everything that we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell starts out there in the world. So how does what's out there get inside our heads? In Module 4, we'll be exploring these questions. How do we detect stimuli in the environment to form our seamless conscious experience of reality? What do you see when you look at this image? My guess is that you either see a hummingbird drinking from a flower or a lynx, which is a type of small wild cat. In fact, I think it actually is a picture of a lynx, but I definitely saw a hummingbird when I initially looked at it for the first time. Contrary to popular belief, what you see first when you look at this, or any image, does not reveal anything concrete about your personality. But it can reveal something deeper about how your brain works to help you perceive and make sense of the world. In Module 3, we talked all about our brains and nervous system at the first or lowest level of psychological functioning. Now, in Module 4, we will begin exploring the transition between our biology, that is, what's happening at the level of our neurons, and our conscious experience. How do we become aware of the things around us, the sights that we see and the sounds that we hear? This is actually a three-step process. First, our bodies must detect some kind of physical energy in the environment. This is the process of sensation. Next, these physical stimuli have to be converted into neural signals. Remember from the previous module that neurons are how your brain communicates, both with itself and with the rest of our body. This process of converting physical energy into neural impulses is called transduction. Finally, once these neural signals reach our brain, we have to interpret and make sense of these physical stimuli. This is the process of perception. Normally, these three processes happen so rapidly and seamlessly that we don't even recognize that they're occurring behind the scenes, enabling our continual experience of the world around us. In the remaining videos in this module, I will discuss in more detail how each of these processes work for our 5 main senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. For now, in this video, I will describe these processes more generally as they apply to all of our senses. First, sensation is the physical process of detecting a stimulus in the environment, such as light photons, sound waves, or physical pressure. If our brain had no way to detect that these stimuli exist, then we wouldn't be able to experience them as part of our conscious reality. However, in order to detect any stimulus in the environment, there first has to be a sufficient amount of it present. For example, imagine that you and your friend are standing right next to each other having a conversation. You probably wouldn't have too much difficulty understanding them. But now imagine that you and your friend are standing on opposite ends of a football field and that your friend is whispering. Your friend is still talking, but not enough sound waves are reaching your ears in order to allow you to actually hear what they are saying. So what counts as a sufficient amount? This is called the absolute threshold. That is, the minimal amount of stimulation needed in order to correctly detect a stimulus at least 50% of the time. Researchers have examined the absolute threshold in humans for each of our 5 senses. For example, on a clear night, most humans can detect a candle flame up to 30 miles away. And under quiet conditions, the receptor cells in the ear can detect the tick of a clock up to 20 feet away. That's pretty remarkable. It's also possible for us to get messages that are presented below the threshold for conscious awareness. These are called subliminal messages. Historically, there has been some fear regarding so-called subliminal messaging. For example, maybe you heard of a famous study from the 1950s that supposedly showed that when the word popcorn was flashed on the screen of a movie theater very quickly, so quickly that people couldn't even consciously recognize it, that the movie patrons were then more likely to actually go purchase popcorn. However, this all turned out to be a giant hoax. The experimenter of the supposed study refused to make any of his data public, and there's no evidence that the study itself was even actually conducted in the first place. Research does show that people can process and respond to information outside of our conscious awareness. However, people also aren't mindless zombies. When making a conscious behavioral decision, like whether or not to buy popcorn at the movies, subliminal messages are unlikely to have any kind of meaningful effect. Sometimes researchers are interested not just in our ability to detect a stimulus in isolation, but also in our ability to detect a difference between 2 related stimuli. This is called the difference threshold, or also sometimes called the just noticeable difference. Unlike the absolute threshold, which is concerned with the minimum amount of stimulation needed to detect whether or not a stimulus is present, the difference threshold has to do with how sensitive we are in detecting when one stimulus is different from another, such as when we notice that one light is brighter or one sound louder than another. Some differences are probably quite obvious for us to detect. For example, you probably have no difficulty detecting that these two are different shades of red. But what about now? There are clearly different shades of red in this picture, but how many? At what point does one shade of red become a different shade of red? Unlike the absolute threshold, the difference threshold changes depending on the stimulus intensity. Specifically, bigger stimuli require larger differences to be noticed. This is known as Weber's law. As an example, imagine picking up a 5-pound weight and a 10-pound weight. It's probably pretty easy to tell that these two weights are different. The 10-pound weight is twice as heavy, after all. Now imagine picking up a 50-pound weight and a 55-pound weight. The 55-pound weight is still heavier by 5 pounds, but now you might have a harder time distinguishing which one is heavier. They both probably just feel really heavy. As another example, take a look at these two pictures. On each side, the lower square contains 10 more dots compared to the upper one. However, this difference is much more noticeable on the left side, where it is easy to tell that the bottom square has more dots. On the right side, it's hardly noticeable at all. When a stimulus crosses the absolute threshold and is registered by our sensory organs, it causes neurons to fire, just like we learned about in the previous module. This starts a process called transduction, where energy from the environment, in the form of chemicals, light photons, sound waves, or mechanical touch, is converted into nerve impulses. Next, these nerve impulses are then transmitted to the brain for additional processing. For example, let's return to our image from the beginning of the video. In order to make sense of this image, your eyes first have to detect light photons bouncing off the computer screen. These photons will strike specialized nerve cells in your retina, which will then start an action potential that travels along nerve fibers to your brain. And we'll talk a lot more about how this works in the next video on vision. After an external stimulus is transduced and sent to the brain, our brain must then try to make sense of this information in order to construct our conscious experience. For example, when you look at this image, your brain is trying to decide what you are seeing. Does it make more sense to see this as an image of a bird, a lynx, or something else altogether? This brings us to the final step in the process, perception. Perception is the psychological process of making sense of and interpreting stimuli in our environment. This process of perception itself involves two complementary pathways. On the one hand, in order to perceive something, we first have to take in the actual sensory input from the environment and then assemble it into a coherent message. This is called bottom-up processing. For example, in the bird-lynx image, our brains might start with the literal data it receives from the eyes, the various colors, hues, and shapes in the image. Your brain then assembles these pieces of information and attempts to form a meaningful picture. However, our brain doesn't always just rely on the raw data itself. Rather, your brain also frequently recruits information based on context cues, as well as prior beliefs, experiences, and expectations. This is called top-down processing. These prior expectations and experiences can often shape how we interpret the raw data, and thus how we ultimately perceive the stimulus. For example, if I had told you ahead of time that the image was one of a cat, you would probably see the lynx first without even registering the bird, and vice versa. As another example, here is some text. Can you read what it says? My guess is that most of you probably had no trouble reading these two words, the cat. To do so, you had to rely on both bottom-up and top-down processing. Your brain received information about the literal shapes on the screen and then tried to interpret or make sense of these shapes. That's bottom-up processing. But in order to understand what these shapes mean, your brain also had to rely on top-down processing by recruiting prior expectations and experience. First, in order to understand the meaning of these symbols, your brain had to rely on your many past years of experience with reading. Additionally, did you notice that the shape of the H in the and the A in cat are exactly the same? Even though the shapes of both these letters are exactly the same, your brain easily perceived them to be two different letters. How did your brain do this? Well, using top-down processing, your brain relied on contextual cues to make a best guess about how to interpret each shape. It makes the most sense to read the first shape as an H because this forms the common English word the. However, an H makes no sense in the second case because CHT doesn't spell anything meaningful in English. Instead, here it makes the most sense to read this shape as an A in order to form the word cat. Importantly, top-down and bottom-up processing are not mutually exclusive. Rather, your brain is always relying on both to help you make sense of your environment. Let's pause for an application practice question. Take a look at this image. Can you identify how both bottom-up and top-down processing are at work? First, bottom-up processing takes the literal data of this image, which is composed of 8 black circles with white lines inside of them. But did you also see the white box? Well, there's no actual box literally in this picture, so the fact that you perceive this is due to top-down processing. Your brain saw the angles of the white lines in each of the circles, and based on your prior experience, it tried to interpret those white lines in a meaningful way, superimposing an image of a box, even though there's not really one there. Top-down processing is beneficial because it can help us to make sense of situations that are uncertain or ambiguous. By taking into account contextual cues and recruiting our prior knowledge and experience, top-down processing allows our brain to make a best guess about what is likely going on. And most of the time, our brain makes a pretty good guess. Our brains are remarkably adept at processing the millions of individual pieces of data we encounter every single day. Sometimes, however, top-down processing can lead our brains to make predictable types of errors, and we'll explore more how that can happen in some of the remaining module videos. In this video, we talked generally about the processes of sensation and perception. For the exam, you should be able to define sensation, transduction, and perception, and be able to identify each of these in an example. Define and explain the difference between absolute threshold and difference threshold, and be able to apply each to an example. Explain the difference between top-down and bottom-up processing, and be able to apply each in an example.